Welcome back. You're still tuned in to News and Views with myself, Salailo Makwidire, and we're going to be switching gears now to a very, very important and insightful conversation. 25 years on now, if I'm not mistaken, Guantanamo Bay remains open, and it is not open because it works, and not because it delivers justice, but because closing it would force uncomfortable truths about power, about accountability, and the global war on terror. What began as a so called temporary measure has become a permanent symbol of indefinite detentions, legal limbos, and human rights erosion, with dozens of men still held without trial, many never even been charged, and some cleared for release but are yet still imprisoned at Guantanamo Bay. And joining us right now is Indy Worthington. He's an investigative journalist, author, activist, and one of the world's foremost experts when it comes to Guantanamo. And for more than 2 decades, he has documented the prison, the men that have been held there, and the political decisions that have followed it to endure. This conversation is going to be a really, really interesting one. And I hope you stay with us to get a insight on Guantanamo Bay. It's a conversation that seems to be dwindling, and it would be nice to have it sparked again. And joining us from London at this current moment is Andy Worthington. Andy, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to News and Views. Really appreciate you giving us your time.
Thank you very much for having me, Sarahito.
Pleasure's all ours. I want to jump right into it. Guantanamo was presented as a somewhat temporary response to an emergency, the U.S. war on terror. 25 years later, what does its continued existence tell us about how exceptions to the law have almost become normalized?
Well, yeah, that's a very good question. And really, they opened it with no thought of what they were doing in the long term. They had an actual intention of being able to hold people indefinitely without charge or trial for the rest of their lives if they felt that that was something useful. So, this is absolutely breaking with the history, respect for the law on which the United States claimed to pride itself. It's, as you will be aware, it is the behavior of dictatorships to say that you can imprison somebody without charge or trial for the rest of their lives. Really, the whole concept of habeas corpus was developed to stop the king or the executive power, whoever is in charge, from evading all accountability and just hurling somebody in a dungeon and throwing away the key. But that is essentially what the United States set up at Guantanamo. And they did that because they had torn up all domestic and international laws and treaties regarding how you treat prisoners. And one of their intentions there was that they intended to be able to set up trials at Guantanamo, where they would be able to use information derived through the use of torture, and would be able to swiftly execute people who they had assessed to be terrorists. All of that fell apart, just as any kind of justification for Guantanamo as a whole fell apart, because you can't throw out the existing rules and put in new rules and expect that that system is going to work. So the reason that Guantanamo is still open after 24 years, and the reason that there are people held there, and the reason it's been so difficult over the years to get people out of there, is because when you shred every legal process, this is the kind of mess that you end up with.
Very, very important to note. Andy, from your long-term documentation of Guantanamo Bay, I think right now, if I'm not mistaken, there are around 15 men who are still held, detained at Guantanamo today. Are there any notable characters, that the world needs to know about, and how different is the reality from the public perception of, let's say, the worst of the worst?
Well, it was never the case that Guantanamo held the worst of the worst. I mean, largely what happened in the early days, and making up the majority of the men who were held there, the men and sometimes boys who were held there at the beginning, was that they were just rounding people up discriminately. It was really their Afghan allies, and it was also the regime of President Musharraf in Pakistan that was handing people over to the Americans, and they were receiving bounty payments. So fundamentally, any Arab with a beard who was in the area was someone that they could just sell to the Americans. And of course, people were there because they were doing humanitarian work, because they were doing missionary work, certainly in Pakistan. And there were a lot of people rounded up and sent from Pakistan. Many of those people had been there for a long time, were working there, were sometimes married to Pakistani women, had families. But they were a target after 9/11. The number of people accused of any kind of involvement with Al-Qaeda or international terrorism at Guantanamo has always been extremely low, in contrast to assertions made by the United States government. A few percent of these nearly 800 men held at Guantanamo. And some of those 15 men who are still detained include, the people accused of involvement in the 9/11 attacks. But what we've found at Guantanamo is that although these men were first charged in 2008, but those cases fell apart. They were then charged again in 2012, and we're now in 2026, 14 years later, and those cases are still mired in pre-trial hearings, because on the one hand, the United States government just wants to pretend that these men weren't held and tortured in CIA black sites. And on the other side, of course, the defense teams representing these men need that information to be made available so that they can properly defend them. And the whole thing goes round and round and round. And it's a broken system. It doesn't work. And that's for one reason, because torture is incompatible with justice.
Most definitely. How would you say, Guantanamo has almost reshaped international legal norms, especially around detention, torture, and due process, not just for the United States of America, but globally?
Just before, if I should have mentioned at the end of what I was saying before,
Yes.
that there are 6 people of the 15 at Guantanamo who have never been charged with a crime.
Wow.
So in up to 24 years, never. They are just detained indefinitely without charge or trial. Yeah, I mean, you expressed a certain amount of shock there, as you should, because this is the behavior of a dictatorship. We're supposed to be charged. We're supposed to go through a form of acceptable due process before we're deprived of our liberty for the rest of our lives. So, that's extremely important. And one of these 6 men is a man called Abu Zubaydah, who I imagine some of your listeners will have heard of, because he is one of the better known prisoners. The secrecy at Guantanamo is such that most of the people held, no one ever knew anything about them. But Abu Zubaydah was the man for whom they invented their CIA torture program after 9/11. He was the first victim of that. When they first seized him in Pakistan, they claimed that he was the number 3 in Al-Qaeda. They've subsequently walked back from all of those claims, but they won't release him. They've never charged him, but they won't release him either. And in fact, in the early days when he was being tortured, and this is genuinely quite shocking, the interrogators of Abu Zubaydah communicated with their superiors in CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, seeking assurances, which they received, that if he survived the torture they were subjecting him to, he would be held in isolation and incommunicado for the rest of his life. That was the request, and that request was honored by the CIA headquarters. So this is a man who has been deliberately hidden from the world, and has been treated so appallingly, and yet the United States still won't even, it seems, contemplate freeing him. So sorry, I needed to add that to what we were discussing. Can you now repeat the following question that you had for me?
No, I think it was very, very important to note. My next question was, how has Guantanamo almost reshaped international legal norms, especially around detention, torture, as you mentioned, and just due process, not just for the US, but globally?
Well, I think the biggest problem is that it's empowered people who were prepared to cross the line from legal treatment of prisoners to something fundamentally illegal and much darker. I wouldn't say that the ramifications of it have done anything to hugely distort the way that people are treated in the majority of the Western world. I think that those protections for people under habeas corpus are robust in most places. I mean, I think the thing to remember about when the United States started its war on terror and established Guantanamo is that it claimed that it wasn't breaking the law. It had contempt for the law. It then went around the world bullying people into supporting it. One way or another, countries of the world were required by the Bush administration to support them. You're either with us or against us, he said. But all of those other countries, all of them, knew that in supporting the United States administration, they were breaking the law. It was only the United States that, as I say, that claimed to be redefining the law. And it's interesting, I think, that some of that arrogance, which I think dwindled over the years, but I think it's now back, of course, under this Trump administration. And I think a lot of the shocking things that they're doing are drawing on the same arrogance and contempt for the law that was what we saw under the Bush administration when they set up Guantanamo 24 years ago.
And speaking on the different administration, you touched on the Bush one, but politically, what would you say has prevented successive US administrations from closing Guantanamo despite repeated promises to do so?
Well, I think the problem is that when you establish an experimental, fundamentally lawless prison on a naval base that isn't on the U.S. mainland, and that was chosen because the Bush administration hoped it would be beyond the reach of the law. I mean, they explicitly hoped the courts wouldn't be able to have access to these men. I think once you've done that, it's extremely difficult to undo. And although, I mean, towards the end of his presidency, Bush admitted that it had been a bit of a mistake and said he wished it would be closed, but he didn't do it. President Obama, of course, came in promising to close it, but left 8 years later without having done so. And part of the reason he was not prepared to invest significant political will into doing something that was so unpopular with his political opponents. But even so, it was hard because the Republicans started passing laws, putting provisions into the annual defense bill for the United States. That made it very difficult for him to release Guantanamo. So they started imposing requirements that certain people couldn't be sent to certain countries that they decided were unsafe. All kinds of obstacles were raised to make it difficult. But the fundamental problem is that you don't set up something that is so badly conceived and so full of holes and so legally dubious. You should never do that because it makes it very difficult to bring all of this lawlessness to an end.
And I think what's rather concerning for me is the fact that there's been a noticeable, almost public fatigue around Guantanamo. There aren't as many headlines and outrage as we saw maybe 10, 15 years ago. Why is it so difficult to keep Guantanamo Bay and the conversations around it and of those and the stories of those detained alive in mainstream media today?
I wish I knew the answer to that. I mean, it's shocking that something that is as fundamentally unjust today as it was when it was first established 24 years ago um, has almost disappeared from the consciousness of very particularly in the United States, but globally has been forgotten about. And I mean, as we must also realize, there are so many young people now who were born after this terrible place was opened and don't know anything about it as a result because no one's talking about it. It was never, except in that run up to Obama being elected in late 2008, it was never a hugely significant issue for the people of the United States. It took an enormous amount of effort to persuade them that it was significant and horrific that this was happening. But there was interest, and as you note, it's dwindled. And I find it a rather sad indictment of people's attention span, shall we say, that if something, if some horrendous injustice carries on for a very long time, and when you get this kind of disastrous policy making by a government like the United States that has such ramifications for such a long time, the last thing that should happen really is that it's forgotten about. I mean, this is, as I say, the behavior of a dictatorship in a country that claims to be a beacon for the rest of the world. So it's very depressing how much it's disappeared from view, and how hard it is to interest people in it. And I thank you for doing this show, and I hope that people who care can be aware that there is an entire generation of young people now who know nothing about it, and yet the prison is still there.
Most definitely. Andy Worthington coming to us live from London. Thank you so much for joining us and for giving us your time. Really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you very much.
There you go. Very, very insightful conversation there on Guantánamo Bay, 24, 25 years on, still open. And I think we can all agree at this point that it's no longer just a prison. It's a mirror that is reflecting how fear reshapes law, how fear forces power to avoid accountability, and how easily injustice becomes invisible when it drags on for long enough. As Andy made mention there are generations of people that have been born after the establishment of Guantanamo Bay that don't know anything about it, and many of them haven't even heard about it, but it's still there. They're still men that are still detained without charge, that are still in Guantanamo Bay, and it'll be interesting to see how the story of Guantanamo Bay continues to unravel as the years continue to go by. And with that, we've come to the end of this segment. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, news and views continues.